Are we on? Okay, great. Well, welcome. We are kicking off the convention here. So if you'll grab your seats and we'll get the session started.
Do that.
A couple of housekeeping items here. All events follow the ReMA antitrust policy. So on your desks in front of you, you see Mama's rules there. So make sure we're continuing to follow those. We encourage you to download the app if you have not done so already. It gives you a chance to give feedback to this session and allows you to kind of check in at this session as well. Cell phones, if you'll turn them on vibrate or turn them off, that would be great. Recordings, I don't know if we're recording this session or not. Are we doing this session? We are. Yes, we are. Great. So this will be available in a couple of weeks for to go back and review it and share it. Question here, do we have any media members? Anybody from the media? Welcome. Thank you. Yeah, glad to have you. And finally, just thank you to our sponsors. We couldn't do it without them, and we're excited to be representing them in this panel. So today we're talking about state policy, key recycling trends, and legislation across the U.S. I was thinking about, so I'm originally from the Pacific Northwest, born and raised north of Seattle, and I went to university at Baylor University in Central Texas. And when I went, first day I arrived at campus, sat right next to a guy, and he was wearing cowboy boots, right? Well, in the mid-90s, people from Washington State didn't own cowboy boots, right? Well, what was I wearing? Birkenstocks. Yeah. So in the early 90s, men in Texas did not wear sandals. I can tell you that. The trend had not moved from the West Coast to Central Texas by 1993. So the reason I bring that story up was I think state policy works a lot in the same way. You may live in a state that's not a progressive state. Well, some of the things we're going to talk about today are going to eventually make their way into your state. And what we want to do is prepare you when those things come into the state to, one, understand what the issue is, but two, be able to talk intelligently about it. So what we really hope you leave this session with is a greater understanding of the key issues that are impacting our states in the U.S. So with that, instead of doing lengthy introductions, what I'm going to do is start with a question. I'll start with you, Suzanne. Introduce yourself and respond to this question. So the Department of Government Efficiency has dominated, the news headlines and been sort of gobbling up all sorts of political capital and letting go. I think I heard the last was 10% of the federal workforce at this point. So this session, we're talking about states. So in your scope, have you seen DOGE impact anything at the state level from your perspective?
Well, thanks, Andrew, for having us. And I'll start, like you said, with a quick introduction and your opening remarks referencing cowboy boots. We have another connection because I'm from the state of Wyoming. And when I was packing to come here, I thought I should bring my boots. But I didn't because they don't travel well in a carry-on.
Nice.
So I'm Suzanne Engels. I'm with the state of Wyoming. I'm the administrator for the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division there. And I'm joining you today on behalf of the Association of State and Territorial Solid Waste Management Officials, commonly referred to as a SWAMO. And we really appreciate the partnership that we have with ReMA, who invited us here today. This year, I am the association president, and I'm joined by our wonderful executive director, Danya Rodriguez. And for those of you that are not familiar with the association, we're a national environmental association that's focused on land remediation. So the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is our main federal regulation, and we work closely with EPA at the federal level at the state, where states are implementing those regulations. So we focus on Subtitle C, Subtitle D, Subtitle I, and then a lot of the states, and Superfund and federal facilities, and a lot of the states have their own state-led remediation programs. So I have a lot of state perspective, and as you mentioned, there are a lot of changes happening at the federal level. And as an association, we continue our partnership with EPA as they go through any potential reorganizations, and working closely with them on any changes that are going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Have you noticed anything? Has anything jumped out yet as far as any changes rolling down?
We've noticed a lot of press releases and continue those conversations. I think we have an open dialogue with EPA to see what they can share and when they know they'll relay information to us.
Yeah, that's good. Neil, you want to introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about how federal things may be rolling into your state?
Sure. And again, thanks for having me here. My name is Neil Menezes. I'm the Vice President of Material Services for Circular Action Alliance. I'm not sure, is anyone here familiar with CAA? A handful of hands. That's good. So CAA represents the brands that sell packaging into the U.S. And the way it works is, as states pass extended producer responsibility laws, EPR, for packaging, they make those companies that sell those packaging responsible for paying and also potentially contracting how those materials are collected, sorted, and then eventually marketed and sold back into the supply chain. And what we recognize is, you have thousands of companies, hundreds of service providers. It's not practical for thousands of companies to try to contract with hundreds of service providers and local government. So what ends up happening is you get a producer responsibility organization, a PRO, which is Circular Action Alliance, that tries to coordinate on behalf of all of the producers so that they know how much they need to pay. And then we help disperse those funds to service providers. And a large part of that is making sure those materials get recycled and put back into the supply chain. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, one of the things that we're noticing is, the laws had passed in California, Colorado, Oregon, Maine, and Minnesota, and 2 have recently passed, but still waiting for governor signature as of yesterday, I think, which is Washington State and Maryland. And what this is more anecdotal, is I think at some point before this administration, there was discussion of having national EPR. And part of that reason was it's hard to comply with 50 different laws, because the 5 states that passed have 5 different laws. So there was this discussion, can you get this national harmonization? The current administration, we don't see that likely happening. So what we feel, and again, it's all kind of anecdotal, is the states are accelerating in passing their laws. We know in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, they're all discussing, in Michigan as well. So that's the pressure we're feeling from states are accelerating this. And one thing I remind people, we still haven't implemented EPR anywhere in the U.S. Yeah. Like Oregon will be the first one, and that doesn't happen to July 1, but other states are passing it, expecting it to be that kind of success that everyone thinks it will be. So we hope it'll be successful, but again, that's where we're seeing the federal pressure, is states are accelerating their activities.
Good. Well, we'll talk about EPR in some detail here in a second as well, because it's obviously a key issue, and want to talk more about that. Sara, you want to introduce yourself and maybe react to how federal decentralization may be happening and impacting your Colorado markets?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'm Sara Cassidy, and I get to work with ReMA members in Colorado. I represent a handful of your peers as their lobbyist at the state and local level in Colorado. And to continue on the theme of the shoes, in Colorado we wear both Birkenstocks and cowboy boots. So a wide range is available, but the political landscape is probably more oriented toward Birkenstocks. And so we can get into that a little bit later, but I will say in that spirit, the way we've seen the federal government's actions in play at the state and local level, it could be summed up with one word that I'm guessing you all are familiar with, and that's uncertainty.
Yeah.
Very high level of trepidation around not knowing what's coming next, and very high comfort knowing that we can respond and adapt and play the ball how it bounces, but there's just a lot of uncertainty about how federal policies are coming down the line. So what we've seen in Colorado is a lot of safeguarding, really, is the way they would call it, again, on the end of the Birkenstock scale. They're trying to protect against programs at the state and the local level that they feel like might be in jeopardy or not valued at the federal level. And I would say that's a huge opportunity for the private sector to respond, to vocalize about what we do, about where we see waste, to help identify or target programs that might, not be as useful, but at the same time, realizing that, our opportunity at the state and local level is really, a kind of a wait and see game, and making sure that we're prepared, no matter how the policies come down from the federal level.
Yeah. Interesting. So you use a phrase, and the world is changing so quickly. There's vernacular that comes up every day. We're going to talk about EPR in a second, but you use the term safeguarding. What is that? And to us recyclers, us, material recycling people, how do we use that in a sentence? What is that? What's the practical application of safeguarding?
Sure. So safeguarding, I would say, at the from the public sector standpoint, local and state governments is looking to protect the programs that they have in place that they see as a potential target, real or perceived target from the federal government. Safeguarding at the from the private sector perspective, I think. I realize that's where my microphone is. Safeguarding from the private sector standpoint is making sure that we're really vocal about the programs that are working, about what we're doing to contribute to the economic prosperity, to returning materials, to manufacturing, telling that story really well. There have already been speakers who have brought this up. In your opening session, I think everyone talked about the importance of just communicating what it is that we do in terms of returning materials to recycling and how that helps with a large-scale, federal level economic picture and supply chain.
Fascinating. Okay, good. Great to know. Let's start with another acronym. We've already used a bunch of them, EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility. Neil, can you kind of unpack, what does that mean? I mean, we run businesses. This industry association is dominated by small, family-owned businesses. So for those that don't eat, sleep, and breathe EPR, what is it, and why does it matter to recyclers?
Yeah, and it's one that gets confused a lot because it can mean a lot of different things for different people. But I'll try to bring it back to like that high level of what it's intended to do. And EPR at a very high level, it follows what they refer to as a polluter pays principle. It's if you are selling the product and packaging, it's your responsibility to go take it back and recycle it. And historically, the groups responsible for managing that would be your local governments or your service provider that you contract with. What made people believe is there is this disconnect. It's the service providers can build in the infrastructure, the MRFs, the transfer station to collect that material, but they don't have a lot of say in the actual design of the packaging. It would be mostly the brands that design because they obviously have to deliver a product, and they are constantly innovating to say, how do we deliver the product with the least amount of packaging? And this is why you see that trend towards more flexible materials. But in that disconnect, what's happening now is how do we now recycle more of that material? How do we put that back into the supply chain? And the idea would be that EPR is if you make these brands responsible for paying for it, then they will have different decisions that they need to evaluate as they manage these materials. What that means for them as from a recycler perspective is now they need to know how the recyclers are actually managing the material and how much of that can actually be brought back. So you're going to see through EPR a lot more data tracking and reporting requirements for recyclers. Because they're having, and I think through the, China's national store policy and some of the other market downturns in the past, also the volatility, there's always this fear that you invest, and I think we've all seen this article, there's so much investment in recycling. And then there are those news articles of bales ending up in landfills.
Right.
And then it just like, you get the messaging, recycling is a hoax. It doesn't happen. So this is where now there's this big pressure to show that these materials are actually being recycled, and the traceability is going to become critical. So a lot of the small businesses that are probably not familiar with some of the more detailed reporting, it's going to come fast and furious because there are some aggressive requirements in terms, and the big risk, and as we'll go into it, is there are responsible end market requirements in all the states, but Oregon and California are a little bit more aggressive in how they define a responsible end market, which to a certain degree also, it's not, the way they visualize it is not only will we know your yield rates, so like if you get a bale 1 ton of materials, how much of that is actually being made into new product? And then the other part is they want to know who's buying that end product. Is that going back into children's toys? Is it going back into packaging? Is it going into durable goods? End markets, recyclers can choose not to become a responsible end markets, but then the MRFs cannot sell to you if they want funding. So you're going to get this pressure from the MRF operators to say, if you're not a responsible end market, we cannot sell you our materials.
So MRF would be potentially subject to penalties. It's not just it's a stick, not just a carrot for them.
Exactly, because the funding we pay is only for materials we know can go to a responsible end market. And if we can't verify it's gone to a responsible end market, then we don't pay for it.
Fascinating. Sara, Suzanne, do you guys have some views? Has EPR begun to make its way into Colorado or Wyoming or?
Yeah, in Colorado, an EPR law passed 2 sessions ago. This is just my 3rd session, and I see some of my colleagues who taught me everything I know about EPR. And so I'll just share that the perspective that we came into the legislation with was talking about the enabling technologies and machinery and equipment that exists in order to help facilitate EPR to happen. And so I'm talking specifically about the robotics, the sortation systems, and all of the private sector, inputs that are part of the system that allow it to work and help facilitate the process of happening. I would say the rest of the producers were kind of split. We had a strong amount of support from the beverage, from a lot of the beverage association. But then there were other producers that weren't quite sure how it would happen. It was nice. The perspective that we were in was really just to talk about the equipment and the systems that are in place to help make it happen. And we were more agnostic when it came to the products themselves. We wanted to let the producers and the brands speak for it. But I think that that's one of the points of pride in the industry is that you're already doing a lot of this. You're already collecting the material and intending for it to reach end markets and creating markets. And so those positive messages were an opportunity for us in Colorado to share a bit of the industry perspective there.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
I'm going to ask Jonathan if I missed anything because he kind of taught me everything I know about EPR.
Shout out to you. Yeah.
And Andrew, I'll share from a state perspective, and I think, Neil, you touched on this a little bit in your opening remarks, that states that have EPR, they vary. Each state has their own requirements, and one of the great things that ASWAMO does is we help make those connections amongst the states. And so as state regulators, we talk with each other to find out what has been successful, what has been challenging, how do we improve on legislation that has been passed at the state level for EPR. And there's different programs for different products that are out there. I think paint is a really popular material, as well as metal and carpet and mattresses and maybe even tires. I think I'm hearing rumblings on tires and most likely e-waste too. So the reporting requirements, they can vary greatly amongst neighboring states. And so I would just encourage, if you have a business that's operating not only in the same region, but across the country, to make sure that you're talking with your state agencies, just so that you can have that open dialogue. Because as a state regulator, we welcome that. We want to help you maintain compliance with any regulation that we have in place. And so we can also be a resource to you.
So it started with packaging, right? But it's much broader. EPR is much broader than that. Just to kind of give you a perspective. So I work for a multinational company called EMR, and we have about 150 locations globally. And we're having conversations with auto manufacturers about EPR. So you go from a fairly simple package, right, plastic, to a very complex final product with plastics and resins and glass and rubber and, aluminum, of course, and steel. So I think my perspective, if I could jump in, put a different hat on here as one talking with manufacturers, I think their perspective is sort of a wait and see. Let's see how this whole EPR thing goes, right? I don't think they're jumping in with both feet is probably the safest way to say it. There's a lot of engineering. Supply chains are very complex with OEMs, as I'm sure most of you know. And so I think their view from a customer standpoint, from an EMR customer standpoint, is just to sort of look at it and say, how does this impact us? And we'll kind of watch the states and sort of see what they pass, because obviously most automobile or equipment manufacturers are dealing in all 50 states. So are they going to have different standards across different states? So that's a tricky part of EPR.
So, Andrew, I'll also clarify that there's no federal standard for EPR, and that's what states tend to look to, is what is the national federal standard that most likely, we're talking about EPA, would establish. And without that, that's when there's all these changing landscapes across the states, because there's no floor. Because states can become more stringent if there was a federal standard, but since there isn't any, you have potentially 50 different standards.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, and it's very core of our republic, our country, is that you had 50 different, petri dishes, of different economic models. And when you start doing an EPR, it becomes very difficult, obviously, to do that. Really, a lot of these things we'll talk about today are difficult to do at a state level when you have interstate commerce. So good. Well, let's keep moving. PFAS. All right. So another acronym, right? So here we are. We're moving on to the next acronym. Anybody want to take a stab at defining PFAS in a non-scientific way, maybe that our audience can grab onto?
Well, I put things in layman's terms all the time because I am a layman. I would just say these forever chemicals that are in virtually every product have become the focus of pretty intense scrutiny at the state and local level as trace chemicals are turning up in water and other places. And so the reaction from a legislative standpoint has been to eliminate PFAS. Well, we know that is a really difficult task when we have products from across the board, from everything from like recreational materials like ski wax to personal hygiene products to cookware. It's to large scale, appliances, and it's across the board, contained in much of what we see and buy and use in our daily lives. And there was a helpful purpose. I mean, we don't put forever chemicals in things to be sinister and because we didn't, care about the environment. It's because sometimes they act as fire retardants, and there are lots of good reasons that products are made with these. So balancing the idea that a lot of products have this, there's a reason they're there, and how do we address them, and how do we maybe move toward different types of products that are safer and better for the environment over time, so that we're not asking for any one manufacturer to have to, fall off of a cliff in terms of how they're doing things and invent something brand new. So instead, like easing, off the gas and onto the brake and then coming onto the new gas pedal kind of more gradually. We're trying to find the finesse and balance of all of those things, I would say. And when I say we, I mean our legislators, and this balance between what exists in markets and then what exists in terms of regulation.
Yeah.
In Colorado, I would say we had kind of a reaction that I think a lot of states and local governments might be having, individually, a lot of different versions of the same thing, which is kind of an overreaction or a knee-jerk reaction to say, let's ban all PFAS from all products.
The Birkenstock reaction.
That's the Birkenstock.
Okay.
So that doesn't necessarily work very well. We all might agree on the overall goal, but, we need to have a few more steps in between. So what we've taken, the approach that we've taken in Colorado, started out as an all-out product ban. It was scaled back significantly. It named some specific products. And the key for our industry, or for the recycled materials, perspective, was to make sure that intentionally added PFAS was defined very well in state statute. We went back and forth with bill sponsors about whether it was or wasn't well defined, but ultimately we want to make sure that the recycled materials industry and any materials processors aren't responsible for material that they are taking on when they're reclaiming materials that would otherwise go into the landfill. They're doing a good thing and helping to process and return these materials to manufacturing. We don't want that processor to be responsible for something that they didn't have a role in.
So there's a connection then with what we were just talking about as far as extended producer responsibility. Those two things have connections as well. Interesting.
Right.
Interesting. Suzanne?
I'm nodding my head, yes, because everything that Sara summarized with PFAS is accurate. And unfortunately, you're going to hear a similar message from me on all of these topics, is that all of these things that we're talking about today is very state specific. Mm-hmm. We saw EPA take action over the last, maybe 2 or 3 years, promulgating a lot of national standards. And you also saw states taking action to promulgate drinking water levels that vary state to state. And so it goes back to what is happening at each state with meeting those federal requirements. PFAS is in everything. Ski wax is my favorite example because it impacts both of our states, Colorado and Wyoming. It's just simply everywhere. And I've heard it described as a glitter bomb. It's just, if you have anything, I have kids, and if they bring home a project with glitter on it, it is my demise because it never gets cleaned up and there's glitter flecks everywhere. And PFAS is like that. It's in pretty much everything that we use. And so I know our membership of ASWAMO, we work with the solid waste landfills who are also receivers of PFAS containing material because they manage it in their landfills, and also at their processing facilities. So it's a constant conversation amongst the states and how to approach it.
So where are we going? Like, what's from a PFAS standpoint? So there's an awareness of it, I think to Sara's point, and now there's some state legislation coming around it. Where's it going? Like, what's kind of the next horizon in the PFAS conversation?
Oh, man, there's a lot happening. There's a lot being talked about. We closely coordinate with EPA to see where they're setting that federal standard, and then also the disposal and destruction aspect of it, of how do we safely do that and manage that waste. It's not clear quite yet. But I think it's important that we've identified that it is an issue.
Yeah.
It makes remediation of contaminated sites extremely challenging. So I'm not sure if Colorado has, or your experience with your ReMA membership has a more clear picture, Sara.
No, I'd say that water and air quality monitoring are where we're seeing a number of the conversations around PFAS kind of falling and centering, where they're at the state level trying to get a better picture of what's making it to the water stream in particular. And I think that industry is responding, and private industry realizes the trend line and is trying to replace these chemicals with other products that can have some similar to the beneficial effects without having the damaging effects.
Yeah.
And so trying to convey that and allowing markets to work and allowing the private sector to get the message is one of our messages to the regulators, to say, we're responding. So just allow that to happen. And it works better if we are working together toward a common goal instead of industry being penalized.
Yeah. Okay. So providing incentives. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just want to add to that, because I think that's kind of the way, again, PFAS was kind of described to me. Is it was really that, it's more so on the packaging side, it was really that genesis of, you had takeout containers in styrofoam, and when they moved to paper-based, well, paper doesn't hold grease or water really well. So you kind of needed a barrier. And at that time, it was kind of considered like innovative to provide this paper product that can hold and create the moisture and grease barrier. And then it took time, after several years, that people realized that these chemicals were problematic for us as humans. And I think that's kind of one of the key things we try to remind with state legislators, because certain materials get kind of put in that same boat as we want to, if they effectively set a target so aggressive that it effectively bans that material, which means you're now trying to rapidly move to another recyclable format that, who knows, down like 5 years, 10 years down the line, there may be a new issue with that material. Whereas, certain materials, we already know kind of what their risks and opportunities are and work within it. So that's kind of the key thing we want to work with recyclers to understand those flows of those materials. Because I think it's so critical in understanding where they're actually being used. And this is one of the more nuanced elements that comes out of the PFAS discussion, especially the intentionally added. There's also PCR, post-consumer recycled content requirements in some of these states. Is if you put it back into a product, you can't exactly guarantee it's PFAS free. Is that considered intentionally added or not?
Right.
And so I think there are a lot of these nuances, and I think this is why working with recyclers to understand how they convert those materials, how they provide it back in the supply chain, is going to be so critical in this space.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges I've seen in working in this space for a while is those conversations with producers, manufacturers. We see the product at the end of life, and sometimes those are 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, even longer than that, right? And so manufacturers are like, yeah, but that's ancient history kind of thing. So what should recyclers be doing when we're having conversations, whether it be with companies or with regulators or communities, that kind of thing? What should we be doing from an EPR perspective or from a PFAS perspective? How can we be effective?
So I think right now people are still uncertain about what EPR looks like. And I think we are even struggling at times to know how much of certain packaging is actually supplied into the states. So I would say for the first 2 to 3 years, it's just going to be a lot of data collection. And I think as companies start to think about where they're receiving their materials from, where you're receiving the bales from, what are those materials that are probably contaminating those bales, and then what are your processes for selling it, is going to be critical in that first step. Because we need to understand what the lay of the land is before we start making changes. So the first few years is going to be a lot of data requests. And it's going to be frustrating. Fully understand it's going to be frustrating. But we need that to understand where additional investments are made or where we can scale these programs, because we believe we'll be the victims of our success. So through EPR is if we do this really well, other states will look to pass it. But we first need to be successful in it. And part of that is to make sure that we can demonstrate that the material that's been collected in the states have actually been reintroduced back into the supply chain.
Wow. Big ask, right? I mean, that's as big as you get, right? It's as complex as you get. Well, another area that we see a lot of activity, it seems like every week I'll see a new piece of legislation come through at the state level, is around batteries. And broad brushing batteries is a mistake, right? You have small to medium format, you have large format, you have EV batteries, you have embedded battery, you have all these different types of batteries. So they're sort of saying, well, we need battery legislation is too broad to be effective, right? So I want to talk a little bit about that. Suzanne, what's kind of, from your perspective, as you've kind of seen these, I know you've seen a number of not just legislation in Wyoming and surrounding states, but really across the U.S. at the state level. What's the impetus behind battery legislation? What's sort of, why all of a sudden the interest level?
I think there's a big interest right now across the board because of the potential risk associated when something goes wrong. There's a lot of health and safety risk associated when that happens. And so I think the legislation is responding back to those unsafe risks. And we, as an association, had our mid-year meeting just last month, and one of the presentations focused on a storage facility that caught fire.
A battery storage facility?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of concern to first responders. And then what happens when the land is contaminated and doing that remediation work. And so I think that's where you're seeing that focus, or why. And we know that EPA is working on doing some guidance on, I believe it's the small format batteries. Thank you, Cheryl, for the head nod. But I think part of those conversations, it just also develops into the medium and large format batteries, because when you talk about batteries, you end up talking about all of them and just what to do.
Yeah. So much of the shift in the electrification of the, of products and all that now is sort of now coming into life too, right? I mean, are you seeing that, Neil, from your perspective? You're seeing this kind of this wave coming and states are reacting to it?
Yeah. And I think last week I was at a Waste Expo and I was listening to Jeff Snyder from ReMA talk about some of this. Is they've invested $100 million in one of their newer facilities in Ohio. And imagine that facility going up in smoke because there's one lithium-ion battery in there. And if you think about the packaging, that is the perfect fuel source for a fire. It's just plastic and paper dominating through it. So I think people are recognizing even some of the other materials, like, I've seen a couch get into a recycling program and a packaging program. So this is what triggers states to say we need to make sure these materials have homes for it, so people don't get creative and find ways of chopping it up and burying it at the bottom of their cart.
Yeah. And
then having that come through a recycling program. So we are likely going to see more of these materials be addressed through legislation, because the garbage, the recycling stream becomes a dumping ground for a lot of these other materials that definitely don't belong there.
Yeah. What are some things, as you think about good legislation around batteries, what are some things that we should be looking for or we should be advocating for as an association?
Yeah, I wouldn't say just specifically batteries, but kind of more for recycling programs, is you have to make it convenient for people. If you tell people you have to, drive 10 miles to drop off, a bag of batteries, it doesn't work. So I think that's the convenience is critical. You don't want to make it to the point where, like a recycling, I can either drop in my recycling cart and no one will know, or I have to drive somewhere. So I think it's going to take some sort of creative thinking in terms of how do you create an opportunity. And I've seen retailers do take back programs with the sense that if I'm taking my batteries back because they're dead, I probably need new batteries. So it's a way of motivating people to say, take it back to your retail location where you purchased it, and then, go buy those new batteries, and it drives traffic through it.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the perfect solution,
yeah.
but it's some of those thinking that needs to happen. So, not saying that's specific for batteries, because it can apply for other materials as well.
Yeah.
But I think that's convenience and education to me are the most critical components to ensure a successful program.
Yeah. Good. Sarah, what are you seeing from a Colorado perspective around batteries? What's the legislation? What's driving it? What's the impact on recyclers?
Yeah. So Colorado just passed a consumer battery bill this session. It's waiting to be signed by the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, and it'll go to the governor and it'll likely pass.
Mm-hmm.
ReMA's involvement there had really been to say there's an existing industry right now, and we need to preserve a lane for that existing industry to continue to do what it does. The legislation creates a battery stewardship organization, which is a nonprofit. So some battery recyclers have said, we've been operating in this space. What's our role? If you're creating a nonprofit, we now have to be a part of it. So there was a little bit of back and forth with that. Key, it's already been said, but fires in facilities, I think, is what drove a lot of people to the table. So that's where in Colorado you saw waste haulers and the environmental community typically aren't at the same table. They were coming in arms locked, agreeing that this battery legislation needed to happen. So ReMA's battery principles were in agreement and in alignment with most of what they were trying to accomplish. We just wanted to preserve the option to continue to have independent collection. And, there was a lot of debate around it. The environmental community said that exists in the law. Nothing will preclude independent collectors from continuing to operate. In fact, we're going to do more education and stewardship. So we're going to shape consumer behavior. We're going to have more drop-off facilities in partnership with retailers. So that way, more materials are coming into the system. We're socializing, thinking around batteries and battery disposal or battery treatment and stewardship, moving away from battery disposal, thinking more about battery stewardship. Suzanne already mentioned the mattress and paint and tire stewardship ideas. I think in Colorado, legislators want to move battery stewardship kind of into those categories so that people become more aware of how to treat those materials and aren't just pitching them in the trash and causing risk at MRFs and other sorting facilities. When it comes to metal recycling, though, I think, the members in Colorado just say, we want to make sure that what we're doing is helpful to the markets that exist and these independent collectors that are already dealing and trading and collecting this material and returning it to manufacturing. We want them to continue to be able to. So that's where the when ReMA's national organization guidance has been, and we've tried to infuse that. I'll just say one last quick thing. Your speakers in the opening session already mentioned it. Inviting legislators to facilities so people can lay eyes on how this actually happens is a tremendous way to influence policy, so that they can actually see what it means when batteries are coming in power tools or in other things that are coming into facilities. That helps get some leverage in terms of helping to shape what it looks like. If they don't know, and it's all theoretical, it doesn't produce as
right.
About
Now to see, if you've been around a recycling facility, you learn every time you go, right? I mean, it's just every time I've been to hundreds of yards in my life, and every single time, I learned something today, right? I can't imagine not being in the industry and coming in and not learning a tremendous amount. You mentioned something.
Sorry, I just want to add on to that thought of communicating with your state regulator and even your state legislature, because that's all good information that we welcome. Get on your state agency's listserv for any public notices and actions, and then also communicate and educate us and your legislatures, and you can help shape that state legislation and policy, and it's really valued and appreciated. I can't express that enough as representing a state we go out for public comment on a lot of things, and sometimes we get comments and sometimes we don't. And so we don't want to be establishing state standards without feedback.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good. So Sara, follow up on one, another acronym, a BSO, right? So a battery stewardship organization. What is that, and how will recyclers work with a nonprofit like that? How does that go forward? What's that look like?
Yeah, so great question, and I think we're making it up as we go along.
Okay.
So the definition will come into being in states that are early adopters of battery legislation. In Colorado, they started with a consumer level battery stewardship organization. I think EVs and car batteries in general are kind of next, and that'll have a bigger impact on the metal facilities in Colorado anyway. So we're just trying to make sure that we have a good precedent set as we come in. But to answer your question, a battery stewardship organization is kind of a combination of a public education campaign and effort to shape that consumer behavior, make sure people aren't just landfilling or discarding batteries, but realizing that's material that should not go into the trash and it should be dealt with otherwise. So that public education campaign, and then it's an attempt, and this is a little bit of a push-pull between the industry and the environmental groups, and this is very fresh conversation, and I'm probably not the most I'm not the closest to it, but there are peers that I'm sure you all work with that you might sell battery materials to, or that you work with as processors who can speak to it a lot better than I can. And they were vocal in Colorado. That is to say, if you create a nonprofit, does that nonprofit capture all of the materials that these businesses and reclamation companies are already in the space to accomplish? And so we've really had to talk about that in terms of what the role is for companies that already do this work. The environmental community has said we need to define it. We don't want to exempt anyone. I mean, to your point earlier about being a qualified producer and making sure that materials meet the standards that, the collection standards. The BSO, or the nonprofit entity that's created, attempts to do that, to create some level of standard and legitimacy around how all components are being treated. And where that came up in consumer batteries had to do with valuable materials versus the less valuable, hard to process components of batteries. The environmental community said, we don't want these for-profit entities that are collecting this material to just skim off the top the valuable materials and then landfill the rest. Well, the markets and the entities that are in that space said, that's not what we're doing. We take everything. We don't landfill anything. And they said, okay, well, then we're going to put some parameters around that in statute. And it's going to require that if you're in this space, you have to take care of you have to treat all of the components, and you can't just take the valuable ones and landfill the rest. So I think it's to be determined what it actually means, but that's what the conversation looks like.
No, it's fantastic. A fantastic description. Yeah. Well, any state legislation conversation is not complete without at least a portion of theft, metal theft. And so I wanted to go to Q&A. We'll cover this and then think of your questions if there's some things you want to ask us about EPR or about PFAS or now about metal theft. It'd be great. We should have a few minutes to do that. So metal theft. So where are we from a metal theft standpoint, from a state standpoint? Who wants to jump in first? Suzanne,
I can share as far as the environmental agencies at the state level. It's a fascinating topic, but unfortunately, we're not involved with the metal theft.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I would say it hasn't come up as much in terms of topics of discussion, and I think part of it is because Oregon and California are both bottle bill states, so the aluminum doesn't fully come through the curbside program. So it hasn't been as big of a topic of discussion for us, at least at this point.
So not hot. Sara?
So at the risk of you hearing my voice too often, Colorado has been very active in metal theft. And I'm going to shout out a couple of people in the room. ReMA's own leadership with Todd and then Justin, who's with Colorado State Patrol, have been very involved with metal theft. Colorado passed a metal theft task force formation. It's recently just sunsetted, just this legislative session. But the byproduct is a great working relationship between law enforcement and materials facilities. And that started around copper theft, around catalytic converter theft, and some of the key commodities. But it's produced things like the scrap theft alert program. And I'm looking at Todd to give me a nod. Thank you. It's produced programs that formalize and normalize the conversation with law enforcement around how metal facilities communicate and coordinate, log, and otherwise help without having to do the job of law enforcement, can help aid in identifying metal theft. Another key, I think, outcome of the metal theft task force is that it legitimizes the businesses that are helping, that are taking in materials responsibly, and that are helping law enforcement. It demonstrates that metal recyclers are just that. They're dealing in valuable commodities, and they're processing them and returning them to manufacturing. They're not aiding theft or vandalism or other things. That's not what we're looking for. That's not the inputs into the process. So some challenges with it. We now have individual cities. We're dealing with something right now, and Colorado members are very active in working on additional scrap metal regulations in Denver, where they are trying to copy the successful aspects of catalytic converter regulation and apply that to all scrap metal. Well, we've had to say, okay, good idea. We'll take what works, but it doesn't necessarily apply. What we were doing with catalytic converters doesn't necessarily apply to all scrap metal. So based on the positive working relationships, the openness to having regulators in and out of these facilities, and relationships with the city council members and legislators, we were able to get markup authority on this Denver bill. We were able to get tag and hold out of the bill, realizing that that doesn't work for all scrap metal. That might work for catalytic converters or other things with serial numbers, but that's just not possible. We talked about the additional risk that comes with stockpiling, that there's no space available. Talked about how metal facilities themselves are targets of theft oftentimes. So we've worked quite a bit at the state level and at the local level. I'd say that credit to ReMA National and Colorado State Patrol, there's a strong working relationship. With this task force sunsetting in Colorado, we now have the challenge of continuing that great work going forward without a catalyst that, requires to bring us together. But as we see new commodities cropping up or issues cropping up, the relationship exists. 4 catalytic converter bills, I think, came out of the task force. So a lot of that has been set in motion on its own in terms of the guidelines there. And we'll continue to work to train law enforcement. That's less of my role as the policy person. That's more of like a handoff that we work with law enforcement. So anything else that I missed, Todd or Justin? And just a true credit, we have Colorado State Patrol and ReMA, sitting together here at this conference. And so I think that is a positive, demonstration of how things are working in Colorado.
That's great.
I'll just share one quick little story. Last year, there was some bronze that was stolen from the MLK statue in Denver City Park. It was a very high profile vandalism and metal theft. The scrap alert system worked. The metal recycling facilities were all talking, including talking to me at the Capitol. I'm talking to the State Patrol legislative liaison. We're all in touch, kind of informally and through the systematic approach with the scrap metal alert. That material was recovered. And I truly think that the metal recycling facilities were heroic in terms of being part of the recovery effort and a partner to law enforcement.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I just mentioned too, just this conversation's been great because I watched Suzanne do it. I watched Sara do it. It's sort of like they phone a friend, right, at the ReMA side and say, are we off base here? Is this working? Is this right? Right? There's always sort of that resource that's really been valuable to us. So a little plug and shout out to all the ReMA folks. See Abby, of course, here, and Natalie, you guys do a fantastic job of that. If you're not taking advantage of the ReMA resources that are available, boy, we as EMR, we're a large company, couldn't do it without ReMA. So as small operators, boy, it's a fantastic resource. They literally will provide talking points, right? Policy positions, things that are really based in science and fact. And it's really a wonderful resource. Much more now, I think, since it's become much more decentralized, more of a state-based policy environment rather than a federal policy standpoint. So they're working harder than ever for us as members of the association. So questions. We went through a ton of stuff. Yes.
So on the EPR and bottle bill front, there's 4 aluminum cans there on the stage, and the poor statistics in our nation is that 2 of those will be in the trash, nation on the national average. But yet every bottle bill that seems to be getting close to passing, I get nervous because the way that they're constructed in their legacy system is that it benefits just a chosen few people that are built to set up the infrastructure for that type of program, where, maybe I'm just uninformed, but if something passes in that aluminum, and it was noted by somebody during this panel that, that aluminum then wouldn't find its way into, well, not just the curbside, but maybe into, for-profit recycling systems. And we operate a small recycling retail level yard. And there's a high correlation of aluminum cans being brought in with other things. So what are the unintended consequences to recyclers, for-profit recyclers, that, these are revenue drivers for people like me? And what if those were taken out of my hands where I might have been able to participate in the infrastructure of that, versus now getting it sort of circumvented? The other thing that I wanted to ask about was about like refrigerant, and that didn't get mentioned, but it frustrates me that we get probably a dozen calls a week of people. I've got a fridge, I've got an air conditioner, can I bring it in? Well, first you got to go get it tagged. Well, my neighbor has a wine fridge. He texted me the other day, I want to bring in an old wine fridge. It doesn't work anymore. I said, great. Has it been evacuated by a professional? Well, of course not. I referred him to somebody that I knew in town that could do it. It cost $50 for one little junk wine fridge. And, of course, he's not going to do that. Right. And, people come in without knowing that. We have to turn them away. And I get angry because I know that that's either they're just going to chuck it in a dumpster, or it's going to go into the hands of people that are not as responsible as me. Either way, the damage is being done, and all I have to do is sit there and watch it, because I'm hearing all this blowback coming to recyclers that just like the PFAS thing, they're getting crucified for trying to handle these types of materials, even if they think they're doing it in a responsible manner. So just curious, are there any tools to help people like me to be able to help the situation, or am I still just going to have to sit on my hands?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Well, I'd say don't sit on your hands, because we need input from industry. And I mean, the facts that I receive from the members that I work for in Colorado help fuel me in the building and hopefully get legislators out of the building and into your yards to say, if you want to do something helpful, here's some ideas from the people who are dealing with this material all day, every day. And so maybe I would say to a legislator, instead of making this requirement, come talk to this guy, come see how it actually happens. Maybe what you do is you come up with a subsidy program where if people want to surrender this product, the state or this program helps defray for the cost of cleaning it out. And maybe you embed that into facilities that would then take that if they didn't have to take on the responsibility. So this is just, you and I dreaming something up, but that's how policy conversations happen, where you say, you have this good idea that you think you want to rid, you want to drive up the recycling rate of these appliances or these, things that we're seeing turn up more and more in landfills. Here's a real way where you can do that. At the next drive, invite people who can take and process this material in, and then subsidize that cost of processing the most difficult part of it. I mean, I don't know if that is like a real solution, but that's truly how I think it's an iterative process with legislators. And so I think that's great input.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll also add that it's an iterative process with state agencies, because we have our state statutes, state regulation, and then guidance and policies. And if there's something that is challenging for our regulated industry, we want to have that dialogue. We truly do. It may be met with some consternation at the beginning, but we're open to dialogue and hearing feedback. And I think it's also building that relationship with your state and having that dialogue too.
Yeah.
And on the EPR side, on the bottle bill, there are two often separate programs. So we really just focus on the curbside, and it's kind of up to the state legislators to determine whether they're going to pass a bottle bill. I don't think any new bottle bills have been passed. They introduced one, and the reason their EPR bill failed the first two times was they tried to build it within the EPR. As you can imagine, trying to design a recycling system that has aluminum cans and PET bottles in, and then a bottle bill comes after, it has a fairly huge risk for potential stranded assets. So I know they're trying. There's a bit of this balance of, typically the beverage industry has PCR targets against them, and kind of the easiest way to kind of feed that is through a bottle bill. But there is a whole parallel network, because if you have EPR and then also where people can drop their cans and aluminum and their PET bottles in, then to create a parallel system has, it's duplicative in many ways. So the discussion will happen, but we were really trying to focus on how do we make this convenient for consumers and show that it's effective. Because if it's not effective, then the bottle bill becomes the next pathway for those beverage containers.
Excuse me. Yeah, I'm from Australia. I represent the industry body equivalent to ReMA in Australia, head that up there. For what it's worth, you're not in your Pat Malone, the fundamental disconnect between state and federal and the disruption of the federal is profound, to the extent that in Australia, Brains Trust politically introduced what they call the export bans, and overnight turned the industry to try and find internalised markets for the materials they collected, because they banned the export of the commodity globally. That's changing. A question around EPR. EPR in Australia is a fundamental failure. It is greenwashing. There's a recent Senate report that's just gone down, and everyone's now calling for mandatory, fully funded, properly funded reporting and accountability. In terms of batteries, we've got a battery stewardship program, and we've got states doing their own thing. We're now having, across the industry, around about 8 fires a day, just in refuse and recycling trucks alone. So it's become a major issue. We can't get insurance. We can't get a whole lot of issues. What is the position in terms of the American or the state? Are they, in terms of EPR, you're so reliant on material that you've got no control of that comes into the country in finished goods. Are your programs properly funded? Are they mandated and are they regulated? Or is it a lot of it voluntary, which enables then the greenwashing to occur, to say, oh, look at me, I'm good, and then the recycling industry is left to carry the can? Is that part of the mix here, or is it now just going to be, yeah, well, we've come up with a good scheme and we'll try and do our best?
So the programs that the states that have passed laws, they're all regulated and mandated. So there are reporting requirements. So there'll be reporting requirements from, and again, it does vary state by state, but for a hauler or a MRF operator to get funding, they have to report. Because to your point, if we don't have visibility in terms of what is being collected, sorted, then it's hard for us to determine why we would be paying for it. So there are reporting requirements. Maine is a bit of a odd one out there because it's more of like a payment without that same type of reporting requirements, more like a tax than anything else. But for the other states, there are requirements for measuring how much the tons collected, the tons sorted, and then the tons sold to end markets. And again, responsible end markets. So they don't, kind of similar to the battery example Sara provided, is they want to make sure that someone's not taking bales, skimming off what is most valuable, and then landfilling the rest and saying, well, because it went to an end market, it's all recycled. There's still this issue. So the reporting is going to be the most critical piece in it, and it is regulated because whatever information we collect, we then have to report back into the state agency against targets, recycling targets, PCR targets, accessibility targets. So it is a regulated program with reporting requirements in there.
Yeah.
One last question, I guess, for Suzanne. Question from an e-waste recycler. Vapes is like a hot potato. EPA, state, is it hazardous waste? Is it e-waste? Gets thrown out the window. Just curious thoughts and comments on where that's going, and is there a solution in sight?
That's a really long question. I think EPA came out with a guidance memo on vapes, within the last year. And states refer to the standards at EPA and the guidance that EPA sets out. And we use that as a state to help make our decisions at the state level of what's the best fit. I think the conversation is going to continue.
Yeah. To this gentleman from Australia, I want to respond a little bit to that too. I think it's an excellent point. One of the things I've gotten to do is be involved in building a sustainability program for EMR from the ground up, and we're a European-owned company, so we have all European standards from a reporting perspective. And I think we've done a tremendous amount of work to get to where, we have emissions from every piece of equipment in our company at this point, and really gotten it down to the bottom level. We're so far out in front of state and federal legislators at this point that we feel like we're a decade out in front, and don't feel like there's going to be anything that can be imposed on us that we won't be able to bring the data related to. But the organization at the state level, at all the states, we operate in 15 states in the U.S., and then buy from, another 20. We feel like we're a decade away from any sort of enforcement at all related to some of these data, heavy things like EPR and even PFAS is probably a little closer than that, but it's not near term for us. What's near term for us is batteries. That's the one that's kicking our butt, because there's this exponential jump in the number of end of life batteries. And, we are, like everyone else, searching for a solution. And that's what I think, if we could wave our Harry Potter magic wand and wish for one thing, it'd be good regulation or legislation that would incentivize people to do the right thing with batteries. Is that safe? Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Carol.
So
phone a friend. Here we go. Mm-hmm.
So I think most of you know that I was in this world for a long time. I do want to emphasize what Suzanne said about talking to your regulators. I think it's great that we have Hill days and all of those things. But at the end of the day, legislators do talk to the regulatory agencies. And if you've told your story to the regulatory agencies, they have that knowledge when they have the communication with legislators. Regulators, that person sitting up there on the stage, they're the ones that write the rules. That they write the regulations. Legislators pass legislation. but then they send it to the state agencies to write the regulations, and they are the ones inspecting you. So if you get to know anybody, you need to know your regulators. They need to know your business. They need to know your business model. Mm-hmm. And so I'm so glad you're in this room today, because I can't emphasize that enough. I'm not going to talk about EPR because I think that's just lipstick on a pig, but I'm not going to go there. But I am going to say, please, please, please think about having that communication and building those relationships.
The unvarnished Cheryl there. That's great. I like that. I like that.
And just one other note on the conversation with regulators, and also to the question about vapes and batteries. Starting right now in room 30 is a session on batteries, and EPA will be there. So as we wrap up, I invite you all to join us over.
Thank you, Natalie, for the transition, and thank you all for us. Thanks for our panel. Let's give them a round of applause. It's great.